incentive drives behavior. And when you take all of these caregivers and you put them on salaries that don't link at all to productivity, it just magically works out that more of them spend more time on the golf course instead of in the office and with patients. And I don't say that to be offensive to any physician, but I've seen it happen in consolidation situations where folks are trying to put together these big physician groups who go from being entrepreneurs that are waking up with an incentive to drive value for their patients, to drive the economics of their business, to where now all of a sudden they're going to get paid what they get paid regardless of what they do. So I think incentives are a lot harder to solve for when everybody's under one big machine, almost like the government.
The opposite side of that coin is that sometimes also I've seen other groups come in and own these practices, and they focus so much on productivity that I hear physicians say, well, we're so focused on productivity, I no longer feel like I'm helping my patient. So there's this completely flip side. And so if you just have one path to success, I think it becomes hard because you can never solve for the different things that are always this push and pull. You want to have incentives, but you don't want it to just be about incentives, right? Because we're talking about healthcare and quality of care.
Right.
And so
there's a symbiotic
yes.
point where everything works in the ecosystem, where the patient is the focus, but there's also this healthy bottom line.
Right.
Welcome to Boombastic Health, where we challenge the business of healthcare and explore bold ideas that drive meaningful change. Each week, we bring you candid conversations with top experts, innovators, and leaders, exploring the latest trends and technologies shaping the future of healthcare. Join us and be part of the conversation in transforming healthcare. Welcome to another episode of Boombastic Health. I am joined by Christal Contini, chair of the M&A group at McDonald Hopkins, one of the premier law firms in the healthcare industry. Thanks for being with me, Christal.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So the topic today is really all about M&A, and particularly for sellers of healthcare businesses. And there are a number of different considerations to be made. And Christal and I recently were together on a webinar for HFMA, the Healthcare Financial Management Association.
Yes.
Where a lot of CFOs join. And I was just really fascinated by the points that Christal was making that relate to, first of all, should I sell or not sell? Am I ready to do this? And then moving into, how do I prepare? Let's say I want to sell my healthcare business. How do I get prepared for that? And then how do I deal with issues like non-compete and other more specific legal issues? And I think there's also just the broader business contemplation of how do I get the best possible price? And also, where are the places in healthcare that consolidation really makes a lot of sense? Because it doesn't make sense everywhere.
Right. And
there has been, for example, in the lab industry, in the diagnostic lab industry, a lot of consolidation already, and some of that's been beneficial. Some of it hasn't gone as well. So Christal, first of all, I'd ask you just to give us your own introduction on how you've gotten to where you are now in your career for those people that are up and coming in their careers. And
sure.
Also, how did you decide healthcare was the place you wanted to focus?
So it kind of happened by, I would say, luck. I have been at McDonald Hopkins from being a summer associate. So I have been at this firm for a very long time, and I happened to...
10 years?
Exactly. No, more like 15.
Okay. Right.
And it was kind of this perfect storm of coming in when the M&A market was actually down for most sectors, but healthcare M&A is one of those constants because people always need healthcare. And so I was doing a lot in M&A that had a healthcare slant, and a lot of it had to do with McDonald Hopkins' reputation in the healthcare industry that already existed. And then I was able to step into the M&A side and provide the M&A counsel around how do you structure these transactions from a tax perspective, what things you need to think about in addition to healthcare compliance, which I know Emily talks a lot about, but what are some of the other things surrounding a healthcare M&A transaction? And so I found myself in this really dynamic area where I could use my communication skills to kind of further working with these great sellers who, started off just going either to like med school, and they worked their way up, and then they built this great practice, and now they want to retire, and they either want to sell to a hospital system, maybe they want to sell to private equity, maybe they want to sell to a public company, and they rely on us as legal counsel to help walk them through that process. And so it has been a very rewarding career, and I love what I do.
So early on, were there some mentors that you had that opened your eyes to healthcare and helped you find your way?
Yes, I would say there were a couple of M&A attorneys that I worked a lot with, but actually predominantly on the healthcare side, it would be people like Jane Pinewood and Rick Cooper, who had a lot of healthcare regulatory compliance connections. And when our M&A team started to grow, they started to rely on us to do the M&A portion of the work that they were bringing in relating to the compliance. So it was this like perfect marriage of, people that have regulatory expertise with people who have M&A expertise. And so I've been very fortunate to have some good mentors.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So you are focused exclusively on M&A? That's what you do every single day?
That is what I do. I'm an M&A lawyer. Probably most of it is healthcare, but because I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and we have a Chicago presence and a Detroit presence with our firm and also Florida, we have a lot of transactions that are also like manufacturing and industrial, but healthcare is a predominant focus because of our compliance expertise at the firm.
And so what's the healthcare M&A environment like right now? Just zooming out for a second again, like what are the macro trends that you see happening? Is there a lot of it, a little? Where are the segments that it's hottest?
Healthcare M&A on some level never stops. I think sometimes certain areas, and I think you mentioned the laboratory space, there's kind of this rubber band effect. So it goes crazy for a couple of years, and then it kind of slows down a little bit, and it kind of like shifts. I would say right now, healthcare is still pretty steady. M&A was down last year, as most people know, just because of high interest rates and just the economy. People were uncertain about it. I have now started to see things pick up, and it is the same for healthcare in terms of areas. I also do a lot in the addiction treatment and mental health space as well. Those areas are busy, and then hospital M&A. So one of the areas that I know you're very familiar with in the laboratory industry is a lot of hospitals, because of pressure with reimbursement and also, all of the other things that hospitals are struggling with. One of the things that they are looking to do in some cases is sell their laboratory operations. And so that's another area that we have seen pick up in the last couple of years as well.
Where more hospitals are looking at selling their laboratory operations as a source of capital or...
Source of capital. And honestly, part of it is just like, what do they want to focus on? Because there are industry players out there who that's all they do is lab management. And hospitals have so many things to manage. And if they can put that into the hands of a trusted business partner, a lot of hospitals want to do that because they can not only monetize the asset, but they can hopefully, and what hospitals' ultimate goals are, is to provide great patient care and find a partner to help them do that.
Right. And they also think a bit about making money.
And that's part of it.
Which is important.
It is important.
So with respect to, this is a bit of a tangent, but with respect to consolidation within the health system world, some people would say we should move to just a fully one massive monolith of a business or something of an enterprise that does everything, and more like a single payer, universal healthcare. Why do we have all these specific little pockets of entrepreneurial work when it should just be this big, almost like a utility that everybody can do? Like, what are your thoughts as putting your business and human behavior hats on? What are your thoughts on that kind of an idea?
It's so interesting because there's so many angles. So I will think about it just from what I have seen from a human angle. And I work a lot with great entrepreneurs and great business owners who like to make, quick decisions and like evaluate situations and like be growth oriented and opportunistic. The larger the mass gets, the harder it is to make a decision because you have to go through all of these different layers of bureaucracy. So I represent private equity funds, I represent small entrepreneurs, and the larger the organization, the more you have to go through the bureaucracy to get anything approved. And that includes something as small as like buying a piece of equipment or expanding into a new area or approving a new payer. Like there are all of these people, depending on how you set up your organization. So if we go to a model that's just like this one monolithic being that is healthcare, I think it becomes hard to manage, and it almost slows down some of the great entrepreneurs who come up with great ideas because they're able to be nimble and move quickly.
I think there's another aspect to it as well, which is incentive drives behavior. And when you take all of these caregivers and you put them on salaries that don't link at all to productivity, it just magically works out that more of them spend more time on the golf course instead of in the office and with patients. And I don't say that to be offensive to any physician, but I've seen it happen in consolidation situations where folks are trying to put together these big physician groups who go from being entrepreneurs that are waking up with an incentive to drive value for their patients, to drive the economics of their business, to where now all of a sudden they're going to get paid what they get paid regardless of what they do. So I think incentives are a lot harder to solve for when everybody's under one big machine, almost like the government, where certainly some good happens there, but there's just so much inefficiency. Well, thanks for your point of view on that.
No, but maybe to the opposite side of that coin is that sometimes also I've seen other groups come in and own these practices, and they focus so much on productivity that I hear physicians say, well, we're so focused on productivity, I no longer feel like I'm helping my patient. So like there's like this completely flip side. And so if you just have one path to success, I think it becomes hard because you can never like solve for the different things that are always like this push and pull. You want to have incentives, but you don't want it to just be about incentives, right? Because we're talking about healthcare and quality of care.
Right.
And so like
there's like a symbiotic point where everything works in the ecosystem, where the patient is the focus, but there's also this healthy bottom line.
Right.
And so I think that the right kind of M&A to your specific area of focus can unlock value by bringing the right kinds of groups together that are either regionally aligned so they can cover their patients' needs better geographically, or maybe from a subspecialty perspective. I know a lot in lab we see if you don't have the breadth of coverage for pathology or the geographic coverage, it can be more difficult.
Right.
And I think that's also counter to some of the national consolidators where there's this certain point of diminishing returns, to your point about efficiency and productivity, where you start losing the connection to that healthcare delivery is local.
Right.
And you don't just need to have numbers on a sheet or somebody typing something out that you don't have a relationship with to collaborate with, because humans aren't robots, and these issues with the interdependencies of different systems in the body are way more nuanced than what can be solved for just through a piece of paper. Sometimes smart people need to collaborate.
Right.
Okay, well, getting into specifically your M&A space, talk about this whole, I'm building a healthcare enterprise, we're delivering some type of healthcare service, and we think maybe it's time to consider selling, or we're not really sure. Like, what do you recommend?
So I love that you use the word we, because usually it is a group of people that need to make that decision. It's very rare that it is a one-person show. It is usually either a group of owners, or if it is like a hospital system or nonprofit or whatever, there's a board of directors or a board of trustees. So it is usually a collaborative decision. And the number one thing that I usually see get in the way of a transaction is when the sellers, whoever that term might apply to, the board of directors, board of trustees, the owners, are not all on the same page. And they are not ready to go, either some are ready to go to market and others are not. Some agree that they do need to sell, and others think that they don't need to sell and they need to pick a different strategic vision. And so my advice always is, if you are going to go down this path, all of the constituents need to be on the same page. Maybe not always internally, but certainly outwardly, because there's never going to be a perfect solution. There's going to be a couple of things that people need to work out during the deal process. But it's kind of that idea of, you don't want to let the kids see the parents fight, Like, you can't let a buyer see the sellers in disagreement. So like a united front is really important. And so
how often do the buyers expect the leadership of the seller to be part of the future of that combination?
Almost always.
Almost always. So if you're thinking you can just go sell out and just exclusively go to the golf course and you're running a practice today, you probably will need to stick around for how long?
The minimum I have seen is 6 months because they've already built their internal team and it's really a small handoff. But usually it's 3 to 5 years commitment.
Right.
And we can talk about kind of like what the commitment looks like from an economic standpoint for the particular leadership team. But it is almost always that some level of involvement post-closing is going to be important. Number one, just to transition. But number two, usually what it is meant to do is be like standing on top of the shoulders of giants. Like, this other party is coming in and they need this group to help them go to the next level. And the sellers need the buyer to help them go to the next level.
Well, said really plainly, they're buying a spreadsheet that assumes a level of productivity that includes you.
Yes.
Most likely.
Yes, that is a fair statement.
Cool. So am I ready or not ready to sell? So first of all, you're saying like just internally the team agreeing we want to sell, and is that deciding if we get these economics for the deal and this kind of a partner, and being really specific about what kind of partner you want?
Yes, I think that's important because there's also this part of, particularly with a health system, like, are they ready to let go of the reins and let another party kind of come in? Because hospitals often drive the market, and I'll say this from a legal perspective, hospitals often have the upper hand in negotiations because they have large buying power, they have large leadership teams, and they kind of set the market. But when they are potentially, and we'll use the laboratory example because I know that's something that we both do a lot with, is they're getting ready to sell their laboratory, and the big buyers are often public companies, so Quest, LabCorp, and those public companies are also used to being the big dog in the room, and they're also used to being the party that is driving terms. And so one of the legal pieces of, are we ready to sell? A lot of it has to do with like, what type of partner do you want? And are you ready to have a true partner, like someone who is willing to, who is going to come in, but are you willing to work with them and collaborate? Because even if you are selling, you're still going to be collaborating. So if you've been the captain of this ship for a very long time, are you willing to let someone else be the captain?
Well, I think, you're saying, are you willing to have a boss?
Yeah. Are you willing to have a boss? And
once
that's
you
hard.
have a boss that shows up and they have a whole bunch of other bosses that might show up occasionally, can you live in that environment? And are those the kind of people that you want to be working with? And I don't say that to insinuate that it can't work. But if you're used to running your own show, that's a big decision.
And we have seen a lot of successful sales. We really have. And a lot of it has to do with setting those expectations on the front end. The sellers have outlined what they want their strategy to be. The buyers have come in and built that relationship with the sellers. And again, it's not all about the money. A lot of it has to do with strategic vision. But part of what helps a seller think creatively about the future strategic vision is if they're able to monetize their interest at a level that they feel comfortable kind of giving over the reins a little bit more.
Is the check big enough?
Is the check
worth it?
Yeah, is the check big enough to have a boss?
And in the scenario that you sell, do you see ever where the person who's running the seller, who is the controlling party, do they ever have an equation where they work for, say, 3 years and then they still have an ownership interest and can still be economically in the deal?
They can. And it is very customized to the situation. But yes, I have seen situations where sellers can still remain. And this is more, I would say, in the private practice scenario where the sellers can remain part owners of the go-forward business. It is often the case. So for example, many of our clients who are physician practices, for example, or even like medical device companies, like more on the private company side, not hospital system side. But for the private company sellers, oftentimes they take over like what is called rollover equity. So they actually have a small stake in the buyer on a go forward basis, but it's a minority stake. So they can't really control the entity, but they kind of ride along with the success depending on the nature of them sticking around. Like if they fulfill their time period that they're going to be with the buyer,
then they get that.
Then they can stick around. If they jump ship too soon, there are usually punitive buyback terms because the buyer wants to make sure if they're someday going to sell this business into the future, that the people who participate in that sale are the ones that stuck around and like tried to make it work. So it's very, very customized. It's also not unusual that when someone leaves the employment or even like any type of strategic input in the enterprise, that the buyer will buy out their equity then, and they won't kind of like ride along forever because, again, the buyer wants to incentivize the people who are building the practice or the business while it's being built. And if you're not going to be there, you're not going to participate in ownership. So it's very customized to the situation.
I suspect there are some regulatory implications as well. Maybe, I know toward the end of the show, we're going to mix it up a little bit on the verdict and have Christal and Emily talk about these regulatory considerations because you're partners in McDonald Hopkins and you do these things together on a daily basis. So I'll get out of the chair, get out of the way since I'm the least qualified to talk about that.
Yeah, we could definitely talk about that.
So I've decided that I'm ready to sell, and because we get along with the potential, at least enough of the potential buyers that we're like, hey, we can get used to this, and my other partners are interested in selling. Like, how do I get my act together in such a way that when diligence happens, it'll look, the layers getting peeled back will continue to look beautiful and not a tire fire.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You want to put your best foot forward. And so and I know everyone says this, and then everyone waits until the last minute to hire their advisors, which I do. I understand because you don't want to always spend the money until you know you have a deal. But the reality is that the clients who go more prepared to market are the ones that are most successful because time kills all transactions. If they wane, if they just take forever, buyers lose interest. They find other opportunities. And so if you can...
It's like time kills all deals.
Yeah, time kills all deals. So if you can go to market and you have all of the easy stuff, your corporate record books in line, you have a database with all of your executed contracts. You have all of your employment agreements in a folder and they all have signatures. Do you know how many contracts I have looked at that do not have signatures? They don't have the date. They're just pieces of paper that everyone lives by, but they're not signed.
Well, so this is the chance to clean all that up in advance.
Yes.
So that you don't put out something that makes it look like you didn't have your act together.
Right, because then you're struggling during the transaction timetable. And by the way, most buyers require you to have signed contracts, particularly with your main providers.
Amazing.
I know. I can't imagine why they would want that.
Right.
And then you have to go scramble to go find them. And then you have to like pull out every drawer and you have to call a bunch of people. And it's just this gigantic pain. I mean, my great clients, the ones that I love, and you're so surprised because it doesn't happen very often, are the ones that like do it from the beginning. And like, that's just how they run their business. And even when things get tough and even when things get busy, the moment they have a contract, it gets signed, it gets filed into the folder. And then when it comes time to sell, they're like, oh, you need this? Here's my share file site. Maybe I've had a handful on one hand that have done that.
So you have this virtual data room that needs to be set up, and you have the checklist and the expertise to know everything that should be there. And then once it is there, I assume there's some measure of you inspecting the actual contracts that are core to the revenue in particular of the seller.
Yes. So
because when the buyer buys the spreadsheet, they can have full certainty that the money is going to continue to go like they think.
Exactly. So we do a full contract review. We review all of the benefit plans. We review all of the payer agreements. And then we start asking like some of the difficult questions, which is like, okay, who is your landlord on this particular lease? And you find out that the landlord happens to be a referring physician. And oh, by the way, it's your largest referral. And then you look and you see that the lease is actually not at market value. And so then it starts to look like a kickback. And so you have these situations where people enter into these contracts and then they stick them in a drawer. And then the lawyers start looking at things and they're like, well, why did you do that?
Yeah.
And most of the time it's because, oh, well, the lease rates were low at the time. We didn't do a fair market value opinion, but that's what they charged the last person. So they charged us the same thing. So it's not like there's any intentional nefarious thing happening. It's more that people get busy. People are trying to provide good care and they're not focused on the details. And if we can find those things at the front end, we can help set the stage or correct if we can, or go out and get a valuation. And maybe it turns out that there's a reason this valuation is what it is. And then we can help set it all up so that when the buyer comes in and looks at it, it's all organized and then you can move more quickly to closing.
So it's not just as straightforward as saying, do you have the contract signed? It's saying,
yes,
do we have an overall scenario that is going to pass muster for the buyer and for regulators and anybody who wants to look at this. And
yes,
also you don't want to end up in prison.
Well, that's an important thing.
And maybe some people, it sounds like unwittingly, could be having some arrangements that need to get adjusted. And that's the extreme scenario, but it's worth a little bit of investment up front to not only make sure that you have a successful sale, but you ensure that you're positioned as an individual to represent and follow through with having a business that is doing things by the book.
Right.
Right.
And honestly, hospital systems are in a tough spot because there's often a lot of changes in management. And so the CEO or even the lab manager that entered into this contract 10 years ago might not even be there anymore. And so now you as the leadership team are now answering for what someone else put in place. And so that's actually one of the challenges when you're not dealing with a private company or a physician group or a medical device company that has 4 owners and that has had the same management team for a very long time. My hospital system clients are unpacking these contracts and looking at these things, and we are asking questions that the people who might have put those arrangements in place might not be there.
Yeah.
So we've got to do sometimes some damage control because we're working now with new management. So this is not supposed to be a moral judgment moment. We are your lawyers. Our job is to help you. We're not morally judging you. These things happen, and we've got to help figure out a path forward and then present it to the buyer in a way that if there is an issue, most of the time, if you present it and you fix it, there's a path forward.
So you're creating, I refer to the folks on the other side of this as the deal prevention squad. You're on the how do we solve it side.
We're on the how do we solve it side.
Because probably building any business is messy.
Yes, no one's perfect.
And healthcare is particularly messy. And also the rules change over time.
Yes.
And so you may have at one point been complying. I know in the lab world with sales reps, it used to be allowed to have contractors that had certain payment arrangements, and now that's changed. And
my least favorite acronym.
Okay.
So I'll let Emily talk about it, though.
Right. You should talk about that.
Yeah.
So there's this other issue, and I think about the freedom of the seller, where today they're in a more of a free market situation. They can control their destiny, but also maybe they're to a point in their career where they want to have a partner and makes sense to go sell, to de-risk or whatever.
Yeah.
And now they're considering what they're beholden to on the other side of that, and that enters the whole non-compete issue.
I'm glad you brought it up. And actually, that was one of the most eye-opening things that came out of the HFMA webinar for me. One of the functions of that webinar is that it polls the audience and they answer. And one of the questions I asked is, what do you think the standard non-compete terms are in an M&A sale when you are the seller? And it was kind of multiple guesses, so they could kind of choose what they thought. And I think I had 1 year, 3 years, 5 to 7 years, and, non-competes are illegal. Well, first of all, non-competes, particularly in connection with the sale of a business, are definitely legal. And in the general M&A world, a 5-year non-compete is the most normal. In the hospital sale world, I have actually seen the non-compete period start to inch up more towards 7 years. Now, I haven't actually seen anyone try to enforce it yet, but basically what that means is you are selling your business, and hopefully you're selling it for a good price. And part of what that price is buying is that you, the seller, will not compete with the business that you just sold. And there is a time clock on it. And of course, I have a lot of clients on the sell side who are saying, well, what if I'm not like starting my own business, but I just want to, work for the cardiologist down the street? Like, I don't own the practice, but I'm going to go work and just like be another doctor, and I'm not even going to be an owner. The answer is most of the time, your buyer will have a problem with that, because the reason they are binding you to this non-compete is because you have built this successful practice or this successful business, or you've grown your laboratory operations at your hospital system to a certain level. And if they're going to pay you what is hopefully millions of dollars, and in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars, they can't have you replicate your success right next door.
Walk down the street.
Exactly.
So if you think you want to work 8 more years,
yes,
then you should probably start a process in a year and a half from now, and then expect that it's going to take 12 to 18 months to get fully ready, run a process,
right,
and get acquired. And then you've got your 5 additional years still to work.
I think that's a good way to look at it, like working backwards from your goals. Because otherwise you find a lot of sellers find themselves like having to stick around longer than they want to, or God forbid something happening and there isn't a succession plan in place. And now that the patriarch or the matriarch is no longer there, the value of the business has fallen. And had you started the process earlier, you might have been able to monetize that and then have the built-in succession plan. But if the main person is no longer, for whatever reason, death or sickness or disability, they can't kind of foster the practice into the next era. Buyers look at that and they think, well, if we buy this practice, will it actually transition? If we buy this business, will it actually transition? And that's why it's so important to like think ahead and make sure you can be there for the transition.
So while your practice is comprehensive across healthcare and even some outside of healthcare, but you do a lot of work in the lab market at HC1, which I run day to day. We do a lot of work in the lab market, and we've seen that space change a bit over time. At one point, there seemed to be quite a few more scaled up independent commercial labs still out there. It seems like a lot of those have been consolidated, and there are certain aggregators that are smaller that are growing, but there now is a real focus in the lab space on these health systems and their labs, which we talked about earlier, where the health system has a million things to focus on. The lab may not be their top priority. And could they partner with others or do something different to make that lab more of a strategic asset? Are you seeing an acceleration of that? Is it pretty stable? What kind of, if you can quantify it all, are there hundreds of these health system deals happening, or dozens, or 1 or 2 a year? I'm just curious for our audience on how active that is.
I think it's active, but I don't think it's hundreds. I think there are maybe 5-ish a year, maybe depending on the size we're talking about. Maybe it ends up being larger if they're smaller labs. But the reality is it takes so long to put these deals together that I think sometimes it's hard to quantify, and not all deals are announced. So that's another thing.
You don't even know.
So sometimes you don't even know they've happened, or that they're even in process. And some have been in process for years, because, especially with hospital system divestitures, they can take a long time. And sometimes it's also not even a sale of the lab. It might just be the management of the lab. And so you're not even selling a book of business. You're just bringing in a third party to manage your lab, which comes with, certain pricing and things. So sometimes it's hard to tell. But I think it's pretty steady, and healthcare is always changing. And so I do think that we will continue to see hospital divestitures of their laboratories. And it'll, time will tell how many there are. And, there are all of these announcements that get made. And a lot of times they are described as like strategic alliances. And sometimes they're actually sales. So It just kind of depends on how the outward facing world is, because most of the time these are private deals.
But whether you're a health system or you're an independent, we talked a lot about the sellers, I think, in the context of these are entrepreneurs or people who have built their businesses. But even in the case of the health system, maybe even especially in that case, because those are the people who would have inherited a lot of other historical baggage. Potentially, they may or may not know it's there.
Yes.
Those folks need to follow the same kind of process you're talking about.
Absolutely. And it's actually probably more complicated for them because the constituents that they are answering to, it's just an enormous list of people. There are donors, there are boards of trustees, there are your pathologists, frankly. There might be other physicians who refer to the lab if we're talking about a lab divestiture. Even people who don't legally have a say in the transaction, they feel like they have an opinion, and you could die on the hill of just like public morality of what people think of what you just did. Like, did the hospital system just sell out? Or maybe it's viewed as a really great thing because it's a partner that the pathologists already work with. And so I actually think hospital divestitures are very complex because of the number of people that have a say either legally or just in their mind socially or morally. And then at the same time, the hospital is responsible for a community that they're providing care to. So there are a lot of pressures on hospital transactions, which is why they take a very long time to get done.
I assume you have case studies out there that talk about some of the success stories.
Yes, but again, and lawyers were kind of bound by different ideas, but because of our fiduciary duty, we often can't disclose sometimes who our clients are, but there are success stories of ones that have gone really well, and those are the ones that there was a lot of preparation involved. There were advisors. I mean, this is not something a hospital system can do alone. Usually there is an investment banker or broker team involved. There's always an in-house lawyer that is involved because hospitals also have great general counsels that are very effective at managing the internal hospital politics. And then you need your outside legal counsel because it is a huge lift legally to deal with all of the paper. And so while a lot of hospitals have great general counsels, just the amount of paper and like work that needs to be done to get these deals done, it is often a partnership between general counsel and outside legal counsel to get the deal done. And so there are all of these advisors that need to be involved.
You know, it's interesting. I was talking the other day to a banker, really nice person that has been successful. And he was talking about a moment in time where his firm did a lot of lab transactions. And I asked, well, where are you on that now? Yeah, we're not really focused on that anymore because it's just not as active as it was when everybody was buying up independent labs. And it struck me that I've known McDonald Hopkins now for, over a decade, starting with Rick Cooper, who was an advisor for the early days of HC1, who's since retired, but is somebody you mentioned earlier as a mentor. And Jane and you and Emily, you folks have been focused on this lab space consistently through all the cycles, which I think is incredibly powerful. We're currently involved with some work where we have a banker engaged at HC1, and just as a strategic advisor, because it's always good to be aware of what's happening in the landscape. And it's an individual who was part of an executive team of a lab roll-up, and so knew the lab industry really well, and is a banker. I've also worked with bankers in the past who were nice enough people, but they did not add any value because they really didn't know anything about specifically the lab space or whatever industry I was focused on at that time, or whatever segment of healthcare I was focused on. And Emily has joked, which I think is a very powerful comment, don't engage your cousin who's a real estate attorney to help you with your deal, you know, if it's a health, unless it's a real estate deal.
Exactly.
And so I think that's just an important thing. And it's not a commercial, it's just a fact. I've seen consistently throughout the years McDonald Hopkins staying focused on the lab industry, which to me makes all the difference in terms of can you succeed or not? Because you've seen the colossal failures and you've seen the fantastic successes, and you've been behind the scenes, I think, on probably more lab transactions than any other law firm.
We are committed to that industry. A lot of it has to do with our history, but also once you get in and start to understand the nuances of a particular industry, and you know this based on the work you do in the lab industry, you now know where all of the pitfalls are. And so you can start to educate your clients, and it actually makes the M&A process and the compliance process more interesting and fun as a provider, because I feel like we can help our clients like think about things either frankly in a way that can be a creative solution to what might be in the gray area of healthcare, which there's a lot of gray, a lot of interpretation, and we can kind of help navigate like where are those lines. And so it allows us to be able to do that more effectively and then also ask the right questions. And it also helps when we are negotiating, because we can start to talk about things that might not be something either the buyer is focused on or that they just might not be as knowledgeable about if they aren't in this industry. And it's sometimes an opportunity for us to help diffuse what might otherwise be what a buyer considers to be a large issue, and it really isn't, because this is like pretty standard in the lab industry. Or we notice a pitfall that our client has and we can kind of like think about it on the front end. So I appreciate you saying that, because it is something we really have a lot of passion for. And I think a lot of it has to do with our history and our commitment to the industry throughout the last, I don't know, probably 20 years working in the industry.
Which we use this concept of web years, which is like dog years. So like it's like 140 web years.
Like sometimes I feel like that.
In this space, which is a long time. And I'll also say when you do these things on repeat, it becomes more efficient. And as the investor, entrepreneur, operator, it costs less.
That's true.
Because when you're paying for someone else to learn which way is up in the lab industry, it ends up costing a lot more. And even though they might have a fancy brand on their building, they may or may not be, they probably aren't optimal for this sort of specialization. So I offer that just in my own experience. And it's the same strategy we've taken with Health Cloud Capital and our companies, where we're very focused on specific segments of healthcare.
Right.
Every single one of them are very large, but within the healthcare world, they're deep vertical, like lab, medical device, prescribing. They're all their own animal, and you need to have experts in there that's all they do day in and day out. So it's been fantastic having you and hosting you here, Christal. And we're going to mix it up and have some fun with Emily stepping in for the verdict, who, again, is also with Christal working day-to-day at McDonald Hopkins, knows a lot more about this than I do. And we'll look forward to seeing you. I'll be back next week, and I'll hand it over to Emily and Christal to take it from here on the verdict. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we are switching things up today on the verdict. That was an amazing conversation between you and Bradley. Now you're stepping into my shoes here as my legal counterpart here. We do work on a lot of these deals together. I think we've seen our fair share of great things, but more so things that blow up deals. One of the things that you guys kind of touched on was compliance and the concept of signing contracts and making sure you have your ducks in a row, as we like to say. And Bradley brought up the concept of the deal prevention squad, right? So lots of times lawyers come in and we're perceived to be the deal prevention squad, particularly healthcare compliance attorneys like myself in a healthcare deal. I think folks don't appreciate enough on the front end the importance of having counsel review arrangements before entering into them. And the negative consequence of that is, in the course of diligence, it's going to cost your organization more money, because your legal team and opposing counsel are going to have to review it and figure out a way to either get comfortable with it or restructure it. You may have to go through the stark self-disclosure process, which we see oftentimes. And for those who aren't aware, if an arrangement is not structured in compliance with the Stark law, Stark is a strict liability statute, which means if you're not complying, you're in violation of it, and there really isn't a way to fix it other than to disclose this. And there's a process where you basically submit the arrangement to Medicare, to CMS, and say, hey, here's this arrangement, here's the value of it. We're disclosing this up front in hopes that we can settle for a lesser amount than what might be owed if you came to us and investigated us for this issue. And that process is timely from a legal perspective because it takes lawyer hours to put together that response, to submit it to the government. And then it's not a timely process with respect to the government either, right? You have to wait for them to come back and give you basically their interpretation of what the issue is and if they agree with you on calculation of damages and where to go from there. So, I mean, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having counsel going in before you even go to market, before you meet with investment bankers, before you even have this decision to sell, or maybe it's after. Maybe it's after you and your partners decide you want to sell. At that point, reviewing everything to make sure that you can cure these issues, if there are issues, on the front end so that they don't pop up during diligence.
I would agree. And it's funny because we always talk about how it would be great. We always talk about doing a legal audit for our clients, even outside of a transaction, because the Stark law doesn't just show up when it's time to sell a business. It is supposed to be a law that you think about as you're running your business. And it's funny because, as I mentioned earlier, time kills all deals. And then you drop in a Stark disclosure right into the middle of the transaction. And the reality is that it doesn't have to be fatal. We have had plenty of deals go forward even with a Stark disclosure process. It's just now, instead of like dealing with that process with just the seller internal team, which is, as you know, hard enough, you now have your buyer kind of looking over your shoulder as part of that process. And the truth is that the buyer is usually a bigger target. And so when they buy your business as the seller and the Stark violation exists, it's usually pretty important that there's like the buyer can't run your business until they own it, but there's got to be an alignment on the approach because the buyer is now going to be running this going forward. So it becomes this like push and pull during a transaction where we don't want to be the deal prevention squad. Actually, what we're trying to do is find a solution to get the deal done.
Right.
But that process is like dumped right into the middle of what is already a really difficult process to begin with.
Right. And an emotional process.
Very emotional.
Because this is a practice that the physicians have built and it's their baby, right? Like I think of when I bought my first house, I got so attached to the house before it was even mine. Mm-hmm. It's similar for these physicians, and no disrespect to physicians, they're just not really great business people sometimes. And so when they're trying to sell this practice that has become really, really successful, to find out that there might be some flaws can be really, really emotional and upsetting. In fact, one time we were doing a transaction, if you recall this, it was a dermatology deal, and there was a Stark issue. It was a physician compensation issue. No, I'm sorry. It was an in-office ancillary services issue. And I'll never forget, the physician emailed me on a Saturday and told me that I was approaching it entirely wrong and that he had reviewed a PowerPoint presentation from another law firm on the Stark law, and he had the solution to the deal, and his solution had nothing to do with in-office ancillary services. And I share that because it was frustrating for him to be told he was wrong or had done something wrong, and he was trying to overcompensate in an area where, like Bradley said, don't have your real estate attorney do the deal. Yeah. Your dermatologist shouldn't be opining on legal issues either.
Well, and it's one of those things, and I always think about like the anti-kickback statute, and I know there's some elements of Stark too, where this would apply. But like, if you think about any other business in the world, like I take out my non-healthcare clients all the time. You go to dinner with them, you take them to a ball game, you fly and go skiing with your clients. Like those types of things are normal and, helpful in the rest of the world, because what you're trying to do is not just shower your potential clients with gifts. What you're trying to do are do activities to build a relationship, right? And to like find a way to have common activities. In the healthcare world, you fly people on your private jet, or you fly them out and pay for their entire ski trip, and you do these things in the healthcare world. You can't do that. Then you're going to jail. So like, I get it. People's minds who aren't thinking about this on a day-to-day basis, or if they have other business other businesses that they focus on. These things are the way the rest of the world does business, but it is not the way you can do business in healthcare. And then you come in and you're trying to like basically tell someone their baby is ugly, and it doesn't go well. And I get it, because that's not what a physician is focusing on or a business owner is focusing on. They're focusing on quality of care. And I mean, I couldn't operate on a heart, so like I wouldn't pretend to do that. And so it's important to have someone like you like look at those things. And then we end up actually having to work together, because once you identify the compliance item, then we have to talk about, well, what does that mean in the overall context of the deal? And I will tell you, the purchase price never goes up. And this is one of those situations where buyers either ask for a purchase price reduction or they ask to place some of the cash in an escrow account, so the seller doesn't even get the money. Right. And we have to wait, as you mentioned, that process for a disclosure. It could take years.
It could take years. Yep. We just did a cardiology deal 2 years ago, and we just heard back from CMS on the self-disclosure. And it was a disclosure because they didn't inform patients that there were other places where they could have their imaging done.
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was very benign.
Yeah. But most cardiology practices are not doing this. And so anyone going to market could have the same issue.
Yeah.
So for folks who might be in cardiology listening, know that you have to give patients this disclosure. It's just a letter. It's simple.
Yeah. And that's why healthcare is so hard and so complex, because there are all of these like small, tiny little pitfalls that if you do it for long enough with enough of a business, and it like blossoms into what could be an issue. And some buyers view these things with a more conservative approach than others.
Yeah. So a couple weeks ago, we were talking about transactions, and the concept of reps and warranties insurance came up. And Bradley asked me for my perspective on reps and warranties insurance. And I said, now you're putting me in the shoes of an M&A lawyer, and that is not my spot. But maybe you can talk a little bit about reps and warranties insurance and how situations like this might impact that process.
Yeah, so I actually have found that representations and warranties insurance is a great product for the right transaction. And like any other insurance, if there is a pre-existing condition, it is usually an exclusion from the policy. And so if there is something like a stark disclosure that needs to be made, that usually comes with some level of liability, your representations and warranties insurance will not cover that liability. So the whole purpose of representations and warranties insurance is to provide a policy or the ability to go against the buyer to be able to make a claim against the insurance company if there is a breach of a representation and warranty in the transaction agreement. And what's great is that they can go after the policy instead of bringing the claim against the seller. And oh, by the way, as Bradley and I were talking about it earlier, the seller is usually part of the buyer's enterprise. So the last thing the buyer wants to do is bring a claim against the party that they are now working with. And so the policy is great because they can bring the claim directly against the policy itself. But in your scenario, if there is a pre-existing condition, it is always excluded from the policy. Now, always is a strong word, because sometimes there's also like creative solutions that a lot of great insurance companies can come up with. But most of the time, pre-existing conditions are excluded from the policy, and the seller has to foot the bill for the escrow or the disclosure, or, there's a purchase price reduction, and that then we get known as the deal prevention squad, and that's how it comes full circle, which is not what we're trying to do. But it does happen because no business is perfect.
Right.
And these are just things that happen.
Well, I think that's an important point, right, is there are always going to be issues in the diligence process. And so trying to take emotion out of it, making sure that you're confident in your team of professionals who are representing you, whether it's the investment bankers, the lawyers, the tax considerations, making sure you have the right team so that emotion can be pulled out of it. You can rely on your experts to actually get the deal done.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we should kick it back to Bradley to close the segment.
Sounds great. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks.
Well, thanks again for joining us for another episode of Boombastic Health. Thanks to Christal Contini of McDonald Hopkins, the chair of the M&A group, for talking to us about her experience with preparing healthcare providers for successful sales transactions. And also thanks to Emily for hosting the Verdict with Emily to talk to her law partner about some of the things that they've been through to generate successful outcomes for providers. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much.